Chosen one, this message didn't appear in your life by accident, and something in you already knows that. Out of everything you could be watching right now, something pulled your attention here. Something quiet but undeniable that made you stop scrolling and lean in just a little closer. That feeling isn't random. It's recognition. Because your life has never followed a normal path, and deep down, you've always sensed that. You've walked through moments that didn't just challenge you, they tried to dismantle you. Situations that should have shut you down, silenced your voice, or made you disappear into the background. But somehow you're still here, still thinking, still aware, still carrying a presence that refuses to collapse. And that's exactly what we're about to uncover, because what looked like chaos wasn't just chaos, and what felt like breaking wasn't the end of your story. It was the beginning of something forming beneath the surface, something even you couldn't fully see at the time. Before we go deeper, take a second right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop the words, "I'm still here" in the comments, because that simple statement carries more power than you realize. It means you survived what was meant to erase you, and it marks the moment you stop questioning your path and start understanding it. This message is not for everyone. It's for the ones who made it through the pressure without losing the core of who they are, the ones who didn't break the way the world expected them, to the ones who are still standing, even when it made no sense to still be standing. And if that's you, then stay with me, because what you're about to understand will change the way you see everything you've been through. And when you look back at that season that was meant to break you, you can feel it in your body before you can even explain it in words, because it didn't arrive as one single event you could point to and say, "No, that's when everything fell apart." It came in waves, quiet. At first, almost unnoticeable, like something shifting slightly out of alignment. Conversations that felt a little off, people who started moving differently around you. Opportunities that seemed to slip through your hands for no clear reason, and at the time you tried to make sense of it. Logically, you told yourself maybe it was just timing, maybe it was just stress, maybe you were overthinking. But the deeper truth is that something had already begun to unravel behind the scenes. Something that was slowly removing the structures you had relied on without asking your permission. And the unsettling part wasn't just what was happening. It was how quickly everything you thought was stable started to feel uncertain. How people you once felt secure with began to feel distant. How spaces that used to feel familiar suddenly carried a strange tension. And you found yourself standing in the middle of your own life, feeling like you no longer fully recognized it, like you were present but disconnected at the same time. And that kind of disorientation does something to a person. It makes you question not just your circumstances, but your own perception, because when enough things shift at once, you start wondering if the problem is out there, or if somehow it's you, and that's where the real pressure begins, not just in what you're losing, but in the silent war happening inside your mind, as you try to hold on to clarity while everything around you keeps moving. And the truth is, this wasn't a gentle transition. It didn't give you time to prepare. It didn't offer you a clear explanation. It didn't come with closure or understanding. It came with abrupt endings, with moments where something you depended on simply stopped being there, with conversations that didn't resolve but just faded into silence, with doors that closed without warning and without reason. And every time something like that happened, it left a mark not always visible to others, but deeply felt by you, because you weren't just losing external things. You were losing versions of reality. You thought you could trust, and when trust starts to crack at that level, it creates a kind of internal instability that is hard to describe, because it's not just about disappointment. It's about the ground beneath you no longer feeling solid, It's about waking up and not being entirely sure what is secure anymore. And that uncertainty is exhausting. It drains your energy in ways that people around you can't always see, because from the outside, you might still look functional. You might still show up, still carry on conversations, still go through your routines, but internally, you're processing a constant stream of questions, trying to piece together meaning from fragments that don't quite fit, trying to understand why things unfolded the way they did when you didn't see it coming. And then there was the loneliness, not just physical isolation, but a deeper kind of solitude that comes when you realize that the people around you either don't understand what you're going through or don't have the capacity to meet you where you are. And that realization can be heavier than any external loss, because it strips away the illusion that someone else will come in and make sense of it for you. It forces you into a space where you have to sit with your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own unanswered questions. And there were moments in that season where it felt like you were carrying more than you could hold, where the weight of everything pressing in on you felt almost unbearable, where you questioned how much more you could take. And yet even in those moments, something in you refused to fully collapse. Something held you together even when you felt like you were coming apart. And that's what makes this season so important to understand. Because it wasn't just a random collection of hardships, it was a concentrated period of pressure designed to test the very core of who you are. And what made it even more intense was how little recognition there was for what you were going through. Because not every battle is visible, not every struggle gets acknowledged. And in many cases, the hardest seasons are the ones that unfold quietly, without witnesses, without validation, without someone standing on the outside saying, "I see what you're enduring." And that lack of recognition can make the experience feel even more isolating, because you start to feel like you're the only one who knows the full weight of what's happening, like you're carrying a story that no one else can fully read. And that kind of isolation can push a person to their limits. It can make you question your strength, your resilience, your purpose. It can make you wonder if you're being overlooked, forgotten, or left behind, especially when you see others moving forward, celebrating milestones, building momentum, while you feel like you're stuck in a place where everything is being stripped away instead of added. And that contrast can be painful, because it creates the illusion that you're falling behind when in reality, you're being taken through a process that operates on a completely different timeline. And in the middle of all of this, there were moments where you tried to fight back to regain control, to fix what was breaking, to restore what was being lost, because that's what we naturally do. We try to repair, we try to hold things together. We try to make sense of disruption by turning it into something manageable. But no matter how much effort you put in there, were certain things that simply would not return to the way they were. Certain connections that would not rebuild, certain doors that would not reopen. And that's when the realization began to settle in that this wasn't something you could control through effort alone, that there were forces at play that required you to let go rather than hold on. And letting go in that kind of season is not easy, because it feels like giving up. It feels like surrendering something important. It feels like accepting a loss you didn't choose, but in reality, what was happening was deeper than loss. It was a reconfiguration, a dismantling of structures that could not support the next version of you, even if you couldn't see that yet. And so the pressure continued, not as a single overwhelming moment, but as a sustained weight that tested your endurance over time, day after day, moment after moment, forcing you to keep showing up even when you didn't feel ready, forcing you to keep moving, even when you didn't have a clear direction, forcing you to sit with uncertainty without rushing to fill the silence. And that kind of pressure reveals things about a person that comfort never could. It exposes where your strength actually comes from. It shows you what remains when everything else is removed. It strips away distractions and brings you face to face with yourself in a way that is both uncomfortable and transformative. Because when you're no longer able to rely on external stability, you're pushed to discover what stability looks like internally. And that discovery doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, through small moments, where you realize you're still functioning, despite everything. Where you notice that you didn't react the way you used to, where you recognize that even though things are difficult, you're not as easily shaken as before. And this is where the narrative begins to shift, even if only slightly at first, because what was once purely overwhelming starts to reveal something else underneath it. Something subtle but significant. A kind of resilience that you didn't consciously build, but that emerged through the process itself. And you start to see that despite everything that was meant to reduce you, you haven't disappeared. You haven't been erased. You're still here, still aware, still capable of observing, learning, adapting. And that realization doesn't come as a loud breakthrough. It comes quietly, almost unexpectedly, like a realization that settles in when you're not even actively searching for it. And it marks the beginning of a deeper understanding, because you start to see that this season, as intense and disorienting as it was, did not accomplish what it seemed designed to do. It did not break you in the way it appeared to be trying to. And that raises a powerful question, one that shifts the entire perspective of what you've been through. Because if the pressure was meant to end you, and it didn't, then what was actually being formed in the process? What was developing beneath the surface while everything else was falling apart? What part of you was being strengthened in ways that could not have happened under normal circumstances? And that question becomes the doorway into the next level of understanding. Because once you begin to ask it, you can no longer see that season as just a period of loss. You start to recognize it as something more intentional, more structured, more significant than it first appeared. And that realization is what sets the stage for everything that comes next. And as you begin to sit with that question, something inside you starts to come into focus, because when everything else was unstable, when plans failed, when support disappeared, when clarity was nowhere to be found, there was still a part of you that refused to shut down. And it wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It didn't look like strength in the traditional sense. It wasn't confidence or certainty, or even hope in the way people usually describe it. It was quieter than that, deeper than that, almost invisible at first. But it was there, steady in a way that didn't depend on circumstances. And if you look back carefully, you'll notice it was present in the moments when you thought you had nothing left, when your energy was low, when your mind was tired, when your emotions felt stretched beyond what you could explain. And yet you still got up, you still moved, you still chose not to completely disconnect from your own life. And that choice, as small as it may have seemed at the time, is where everything begins to change, because that wasn't just survival, that was evidence of something within you that does not operate on the same rules as everything around you. And the reason this matters is because most people, when they face that level of pressure, begin to shut down in ways that are difficult to reverse. They disconnect from themselves. They lose their sense of direction. They adapt to the pressure by shrinking, by becoming less, by lowering their expectations of what life can be. But you didn't do that, not fully, even when you were overwhelmed, even when you were confused, even when you questioned everything. There was still a line inside you that you didn't cross. There was still a part of you that said, even if silently, this is not where I end. And that internal boundary is what separated you from being completely consumed by that season. Because once a person fully accepts collapse as their identity, it becomes much harder to rebuild. But you never fully accepted that version of yourself. You entertained the possibility of breaking. You felt the weight of it, but you didn't sign your name to it. And that distinction is subtle, but it is powerful. And what makes this even more significant is that you didn't have external reinforcement to hold on to. You weren't surrounded by constant encouragement. You weren't given clear answers or a roadmap out of the situation. You weren't handed a moment of clarity that explained everything and made it easier to endure. You had to navigate it in real time with incomplete information, with emotions that didn't always make sense, with circumstances that didn't follow logic. And in that environment, the only thing you could truly rely on was that internal signal that kept you moving forward, even if the steps were small, even if the progress wasn't visible, even if you didn't feel like you were making progress at all. And that is what reveals the nature of what you were carrying. Because that kind of persistence does not come from surface-level motivation. It comes from something embedded deeper, something that does not require constant validation to remain active. And you might not have recognized it at the time because when you're in the middle of a difficult season, your focus is on getting through it, not analyzing how you're getting through it. You're not sitting there thinking about the mechanics of your resilience. You're just trying to make it to the next moment, the next day, the next decision. But now, looking back with more clarity, you can begin to see that there was a pattern in how you responded, a consistency in how you continued, even when the reasons to stop seemed stronger than the reasons to keep going. And that pattern is not accidental. It points to a part of you that is structured differently, a part that does not depend entirely on external conditions to function. And this is where the narrative shifts in a deeper way, because once you recognize that there was something in you that refused to die, you also begin to understand that the season you went through was not just testing your limits. It was revealing your baseline. It was showing you what remains when everything else is removed, what continues when support is gone, what persists when certainty is gone. And what you discovered, whether consciously or not, is that your baseline is stronger than you thought, more stable than you expected, and more independent than the environment you were in. And that realization changes how you interpret everything that happened. Because now, instead of seeing that season as proof of your vulnerability, you can begin to see it as proof of your internal structure. And the more you sit with that understanding, the more you start to notice that what kept you going was not tied to any one outcome. It wasn't because you knew things would work out in a specific way. It wasn't because you had guarantees or promises or visible signs that everything would resolve. It was something more fundamental than that, something that didn't require you to see the end in order to keep moving toward it. And that is what makes it so difficult for others to understand. Because from the outside, it might look like you were just enduring, just surviving, just getting by, but from the inside, there was a process unfolding, a strengthening that was happening without needing to be announced. And that kind of development is not always visible in real time, but it becomes undeniable when you look back and realize how much you carried without collapsing under it. And this is also why you began to change in ways that you didn't immediately notice, because when a person operates from that kind of internal stability, it starts to affect how they perceive situations, how they respond to pressure, how they engage with people, even if they're not consciously trying to change. The shift happens naturally because once you've experienced that level of internal endurance, you can't go back to reacting the same way you did before. You can't unlearn what you discovered about yourself. You can't pretend that you are as fragile as you once believed, because you now have evidence to the contrary. And that evidence doesn't come from theory. It comes from lived experience, from moments where you could have shut down but didn't, from decisions where you could have given up but chose not to. Even if that choice was quiet, even if it wasn't dramatic, even if no one else noticed it happening. And this is where the deeper power begins to emerge, not as something loud or forceful, but as something grounded, something stable, something that doesn't need to prove itself constantly because it has already been tested. And that kind of power is different from what most people recognize. It's not reactive. It's not dependent on circumstances. It doesn't rise and fall with external validation. It simply exists, steady and present regardless of what is happening around it. And that is what makes it so difficult to break, because it is not built on temporary conditions. It is built on something more fundamental, something that was revealed, not created during that season. And as you continue to reflect on this, you begin to understand that what you carried through that period was not just resilience in the ordinary sense. It was a form of alignment, a connection to something within you that remained intact, even when everything else felt unstable. And that alignment is what allowed you to keep moving without needing to fully understand where you were going. It allowed you to take steps without needing to see the entire path. It allowed you to continue without needing constant reassurance. And that ability is rare because most people require a certain level of clarity to maintain momentum. But you learned how to move even in uncertainty, how to continue even when the outcome was unclear. And that skill, that internal orientation, becomes one of the most valuable things you carry forward, because it changes how you approach everything that comes next. And now, standing on the other side of that realization, you can begin to see that the part of you that refused to die was never weak. It was never small. It was never temporary. It was simply untested until that moment. And once it was tested, once it was pushed to its limits and still remained, it became something you could no longer ignore, something you could no longer doubt in the same way. And that is where the next level of your story begins, because once you know that you carry something that does not collapse under pressure, you can no longer see yourself through the same lens. You can no longer define yourself by the circumstances that once tried to define you, and you begin to step into a different understanding of who you are, not based on what you've been through alone, but based on what remained when you went through it. And that shift in understanding is what sets the foundation for everything that follows, because now you are not just someone who survived a difficult season. You are someone who has identified a core within yourself that cannot be easily broken, and that changes the way you move, the way you think, the way you respond, even if the world around you has not yet caught up to that change. And once you begin to recognize that there was a part of you that refused to die, the next realization starts to unfold almost quietly, almost unexpectedly, because what you went through didn't just leave you intact. It changed you. It expanded you in ways that are not always visible at first glance, because expansion doesn't always look like growth on the surface. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal, like silence, like stepping back and observing, instead of reacting, like taking longer to respond, like no longer feeling the need to explain yourself to everyone who misunderstands you. And if you're honest, there are moments now where you notice that you don't move the way you used to. You don't engage the same way. You don't get pulled into the same emotional patterns. And that's not because you've become cold or distant. It's because something in you has deepened, something in you has learned through experience what used to take explanation. And what's important to understand is that this expansion did not come from comfort. It came from pressure. It came from being placed in situations where you had to observe more carefully, where you had to listen more closely, where you had to pay attention not just to what people were saying, but to what they were not saying, to the gaps, to the inconsistencies, to the subtle shifts in energy that most people overlook. And over time, without even trying to develop this ability, you started to see patterns in behavior, patterns in conversations, patterns in how situations unfold. And once you start seeing patterns, you can't unsee them, because they begin to connect. They begin to form a structure, a kind of internal map that helps you understand what's really happening beneath the surface. And that changes everything, because now you're no longer just reacting to events as they happen. You're recognizing the underlying movements that lead to those events. And this is where the real expansion begins, because awareness changes your position. It shifts you from being inside the chaos to being able to observe it. And that shift creates space between what happens and how you respond to it, space between what someone says and what you choose to believe, space between what you feel and what you act on. And that space is where your power starts to grow, because once you have that distance, you're no longer controlled by immediate reactions. You're no longer pulled in every direction by external pressure. You're able to pause, to assess, to decide. And that level of intentionality is something you didn't have access to before. Not because you weren't capable, but because you hadn't been pushed into a position where you needed to develop it. And what's even more significant is that this expansion didn't just affect how you see others, it affected how you see yourself, because when you go through a process like this, you begin to recognize your own patterns as well. You start to see where you once overextended, where you once ignored your intuition, where you once gave more than was sustainable, where you once stayed in situations longer than you should have. And this awareness is not meant to create regret, it's meant to create clarity, because once you can see those patterns, you can begin to change them. You can begin to move differently, to set boundaries more clearly, to trust your internal signals more confidently. And that is part of the expansion, not just seeing the external world more clearly, but seeing yourself more accurately. And this is why what was meant to shrink you ended up expanding you, because instead of closing you off completely, it forced you to open your perception. It forced you to become more aware, more discerning, more intentional. And that kind of growth is not superficial. It's not something that fades when circumstances improve. It becomes part of how you operate, part of how you move through the world. And that's why you may feel different now, even if you can't fully explain it to others, because your internal landscape has changed. Your baseline has shifted, and you're no longer navigating life from the same level of awareness you once had. And this is also where people begin to notice something about you, even if they can't put it into words. Because when someone's awareness expands, it changes their presence, it changes the way they carry themselves, the way they engage, the way they respond. And others can feel that even if they don't understand it, even if they don't know what exactly has changed, they sense that you are not as easily influenced, not as easily swayed, not as easily drawn into things that once would have pulled you in. And that creates a kind of tension, because people are used to interacting with a certain version of you. And when that version changes, it disrupts the dynamic. It challenges expectations. It forces them to adjust, and not everyone is comfortable with that adjustment. And what makes this even more complex is that this expansion doesn't always come with immediate clarity about where you're going next. Because just because you've grown doesn't mean everything around you has caught up to that growth. You may still be in environments that reflect an older version of you. You may still be interacting with people who expect you to respond the way you used to, and that can create a sense of misalignment, a feeling that something no longer fits the way it once did. And that feeling is not a mistake. It's a signal. It's an indication that your internal expansion is creating a need for external alignment, and that process takes time. It doesn't happen all at once, it unfolds gradually as you continue to move in accordance with what you now understand. And this is where patience becomes important, because expansion can feel uncomfortable when your external reality hasn't fully adjusted, yet it can feel like you're between versions of yourself, no longer who you were, but not fully settled into who you're becoming. And that in-between space can feel uncertain, but it's also where a lot of integration happens. It's where your new awareness becomes stable, where your new patterns become consistent, where your new boundaries become natural rather than forced. And as that happens, you begin to notice that you're no longer second-guessing yourself in the same way you're no longer questioning your instincts as often. You're no longer ignoring what you feel deep down, because you've learned through experience that those internal signals are not random. They are part of how you navigate effectively. And as this continues, something else begins to emerge. Something that is not always immediately obvious, but becomes clearer over time. And that is a sense of internal authority, not authority over others, but authority within yourself, a sense that you trust your perception, that you trust your decisions, that you trust your ability to navigate situations without needing constant external confirmation. And that shift is powerful because it changes how you show up in every area of your life. It changes how you communicate, how you make choices, how you respond to challenges, and it also changes what you tolerate. Because once you operate from that level of awareness, you can no longer ignore what doesn't align. You can no longer pretend not to see what you clearly recognize, and that can lead to changes in your environment, in your relationships, in your direction. Not because you're trying to force change, but because your expansion naturally requires a different level of alignment. And this is why what happened to you was not just a period of hardship. It was a process of expansion, a process that took you beyond the version of yourself that existed before, a process that gave you access to a level of awareness and discernment that you didn't have before. And even though it came through difficulty, it has created something within you that cannot easily be undone, something that continues to influence how you move forward, how you interpret situations, how you engage with the world. And as you continue to build on that, as you continue to trust what has been developed within you, you begin to step into a version of yourself that is not only more resilient, but more aware, more intentional, and more aligned with what is true for you. And that is where the deeper transformation begins to take shape. Because now you are not just someone who endured, you are someone who has expanded. And that expansion sets the stage for everything that comes next. And as that expansion within you becomes more stable, more integrated, more natural to the way you move and think and respond, something else begins to happen that you may not have anticipated. Because at a certain point, the shift inside you stops being invisible. It starts to register externally, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in subtle changes that people around you begin to notice, even if they can't fully explain what they're seeing. And this is where the dynamic between you and your environment starts to shift, because the version of you they once understood no longer behaves in predictable ways, no longer reacts in familiar patterns, no longer engages in the same cycles that used to define your interactions. And that creates a kind of quiet disruption, not because you are trying to disrupt anything, but because growth naturally changes the way energy moves through a space. And when that energy changes, people feel it, even if they don't have the language to describe it. And what's interesting is that the first thing they notice is not necessarily what you say. It's how you carry yourself, it's the pauses in your responses, the way you listen more than you speak, the way you don't rush to fill silence, the way you no longer react instantly to things that once would have triggered you. And those small differences carry weight because they signal something deeper. They signal that you are no longer operating from the same internal structure. And that can be unsettling for people who were used to a different version of you because they relied on your predictability. They understood how to engage with you based on who you were. And now that framework no longer applies, and when a framework breaks, people instinctively try to rebuild it. They try to figure out what changed, to label it, to explain it, to make it make sense within their existing understanding. And this is where you might notice subtle shifts in how people interact with you. Questions that seem casual but carry an underlying attempt to understand you. comments that reflect confusion or curiosity, moments where people test boundaries that you no longer allow to be crossed. And all of this is part of the adjustment process, because when someone encounters a version of you that they can't easily categorize, it challenges their perception. It forces them to reconsider what they thought they knew. And not everyone is comfortable with that process. Some will lean into it. Some will respect the change, but others may resist it. Not necessarily out of negativity, but out of unfamiliarity, because what they're experiencing is a version of you that does not fit neatly into their expectations. And the reason they can't explain you is because what has changed in you is not surface level. It's not something that can be easily pointed to or defined. It's not just a new habit or a new mindset. It's a deeper recalibration of how you process, how you perceive, how you decide. And those kinds of changes are difficult to articulate from the outside because they don't always have visible markers. They show up in consistency rather than in isolated moments. They show up in what you no longer do as much as in what you do. And that makes it harder for others to grasp because they are looking for something obvious. Something they can name, something they can reduce to a simple explanation. But what they are encountering is something more complex, something that developed over time through experiences they may not have fully witnessed or understood. And this creates a unique kind of tension, because on one hand, you are becoming more aligned with yourself, more grounded, more clear, but on the other hand, that alignment can create distance in relationships that were built on a different version of you. And that distance is not always dramatic. It can be subtle. It can show up in conversations that feel slightly off, in interactions that no longer flow the same way, in a sense that something has shifted, even if nothing specific has been said. And navigating that can feel unfamiliar, because you are adjusting not just to who you are becoming, but to how others are responding to that version of you. And this is where it becomes important to stay anchored in what you've developed, because the moment you start adjusting yourself back to fit old expectations, you begin to dilute the very growth that brought you here. And while it may feel easier in the moment to return to what is familiar, to respond the way people expect, to re-enter patterns that are comfortable for others, doing so would come at the cost of your alignment. And that cost is something you can now feel more clearly than before. Because once you've experienced operating from a place of internal clarity, going back to confusion feels heavier, more noticeable, more draining. And that awareness is part of what keeps you moving forward, even when the adjustment around you feels uncertain. And over time, what you begin to notice is that the people who are able to meet you at this new level of awareness will naturally remain. They will adapt. They will engage with you in ways that reflect who you are now rather than who you used to be. And those connections will feel more aligned, more stable, more authentic, while others may gradually fade, not necessarily through conflict, but through a natural divergence, a recognition that the dynamic no longer serves both sides in the same way. And that process, while sometimes uncomfortable, is also part of the refinement, part of the alignment that follows expansion. And so what you are experiencing is not just people noticing you, it's people responding to a version of you that they cannot fully define, and that inability to define you is not a weakness. It is a reflection of the depth of your transformation, because you are no longer operating within the same limits that once made you easy to categorize. You have moved beyond that, into a space that requires a different level of understanding. And not everyone will reach that level. But that does not diminish what you have become. It simply clarifies who is able to walk with you as you continue forward. Because the truth is, you were never meant to remain easily defined. And the fact that they can't fully explain you now is a sign that something real has changed. Something that cannot be reduced to a simple label, something that continues to unfold as you step further into who you are becoming. And as this shift becomes more visible, and the people around you begin to sense that you are no longer operating the way you once did, the real turning point quietly takes place within you, not in a dramatic announcement, not in a moment where everything suddenly changes overnight, but in a series of internal decisions that alter the way you relate to yourself and to others. Because at some point along this journey, you stopped seeking validation in the places that once defined your sense of worth. You stopped measuring your value based on how well you were understood, how easily you were accepted, or how consistently you were affirmed by people who never fully saw you clearly in the first place. And that shift, while it may seem subtle on the surface, carries a depth that changes everything. Because when you no longer rely on external approval to stabilize your identity, you remove one of the primary mechanisms through which people influence, shape, and in some cases control your behavior. And what makes this moment so powerful is that it doesn't come from rejection or bitterness. It comes from realization, from the understanding that constantly explaining yourself to those who lack the capacity to understand you is not a path to clarity. It is a cycle that keeps you anchored in misunderstanding. And once you see that clearly, once you feel the weight of how much energy it has cost you to maintain that cycle, something inside you naturally begins to withdraw from it. Not out of anger, but out of alignment, because you begin to recognize that your energy is better invested in being consistent with who you are, rather than convincing others of who you are. And as you step into that space, you may notice that your interactions begin to change in ways that are difficult to reverse. You no longer feel the same urgency to respond immediately to every message, to clarify every misunderstanding, to defend every decision, to justify every boundary. Instead, you find yourself pausing, choosing when and how to engage, allowing silence to exist without feeling the need to fill it. And that shift can be unsettling at first, because for a long time, you may have been conditioned to equate responsiveness with value, to believe that being available, being agreeable, being easily understood was part of maintaining connection. But now you are learning that true connection does not require constant explanation. It requires alignment, and alignment cannot be forced through over-explanation. It can only be experienced when both sides are able to meet at the same level of understanding. And this is where the external response begins to shift even more noticeably, because when you stop seeking validation, the people who were accustomed to providing it or withholding it lose a point of influence. They can no longer guide your behavior through approval or disapproval in the same way, and that change can create confusion. It can create questions. It can even create subtle resistance because your unpredictability is not coming from inconsistency. It is coming from independence, and independence, when it appears suddenly in someone who was once more predictable, can feel like a disruption to those who relied on your previous patterns to navigate their interactions with you. And what's important to understand is that this unpredictability is not a flaw. It is a sign that you are no longer operating on autopilot. You are no longer responding based solely on habit, expectation, or external pressure. You are responding from a place of awareness, from a place of intentionality, from a place that evaluates each situation rather than reacting to it. And that kind of presence cannot be easily controlled because it does not follow a fixed script. It adapts it, observes it, chooses, and that makes it difficult for others to anticipate how you will respond, especially if they are still approaching you with an understanding that is based on who you used to be rather than who you are now. And this is also where you may begin to feel a deeper sense of internal stability, not because everything around you has become predictable, but because you are no longer dependent on that predictability to feel grounded. You are no longer searching for constant reassurance that you are on the right path. You are no longer waiting for others to confirm what you already sense internally. And that shift creates a kind of quiet confidence, not loud, not performative, but steady, consistent, present, a confidence that does not need to be announced, because it is reflected in how you move, how you speak, how you decide, and how you choose what to engage with and what to leave untouched. And as this continues, you begin to notice that certain dynamics naturally fall away, not because you actively push them out, but because they no longer have the same hold on you. The same patterns that once pulled you in no longer have the same effect. The same conversations that once drained you no longer feel necessary. The same situations that once required your involvement no longer demand your energy, and this is not a loss, it is a refinement. It is the natural result of aligning your actions with your awareness. And while that refinement may create space, it also creates clarity, because in that space you are able to see more clearly what truly aligns with you and what does not. And this is where the deeper transformation becomes undeniable, because you are no longer trying to fit into environments that require you to minimize yourself. You are no longer adjusting your identity to maintain comfort for others. You are no longer negotiating your sense of self in exchange for acceptance, and that level of self-consistency is what makes you difficult to control, because control often relies on a person's need for approval, their fear of rejection, their desire to be understood. And when those factors no longer dictate your decisions in the same way, the usual methods of influence begin to lose their effectiveness. And so what you are stepping into is not just independence in the surface sense. It is a deeper form of internal authority, a way of moving through the world that is guided more by alignment than by external reaction. And while that may feel unfamiliar at times, it is also where your strength becomes most evident, because you are no longer being shaped by every external force that comes your way. You are choosing how to engage, when to engage, and whether to engage at all. And that level of choice is what marks the difference between someone who is still being pulled by their environment and someone who is beginning to move with intention. And as you continue to build on that, you will find that your path becomes clearer, not because everything is explained in advance, but because you trust yourself to navigate it as it unfolds. And that trust is something no one else can define for you, no one else can grant to you. It is something you have developed through what you have already endured, and it is what will carry you into everything that comes next. And as you continue to move from that place of internal authority, no longer driven by the need for validation, no longer shaped by external expectations, something else begins to unfold at a level that is more subtle but far more significant. Because when a pattern becomes consistent, when a trajectory begins to stabilize, it does not go unnoticed, even if no one announces it directly. Even if there is no obvious moment where someone steps forward and says they see what is happening, there are always observers, whether they are people in your environment, individuals in positions of influence, or even systems that respond to consistency and presence over time. And what they are observing is not just your actions. It is your pattern, the way you respond under pressure, the way you carry yourself without needing constant reinforcement, the way you continue without seeking permission. And patterns like that carry weight because they signal something that cannot be easily manufactured or imitated. And what makes this stage so important is that the observation happening around you is not based on a single moment. It is based on accumulation, on repeated evidence that you do not revert back to who you were when things become difficult, that you do not collapse under pressure the way others might expect, that you maintain a level of consistency that suggests there is something deeper anchoring you. And when that kind of consistency becomes visible, it naturally raises questions, not always spoken, but present. Nonetheless, questions about what drives you, what sustains you, what allows you to operate the way you do. And those questions are part of the process of being studied, not in a negative sense, but in a way that reflects recognition. Because when something does not follow the usual pattern, it draws attention. And you may not always be aware of this attention, because it does not always come in obvious forms. It may show up in the way certain people start paying closer attention to your decisions, in the way opportunities begin to appear that were not available before, in the way conversations shift in tone, becoming more intentional, more focused, as if there is a deeper level of engagement taking place. And while it may feel subtle, it is significant, because it indicates that your presence is being registered in a different way, not just as someone moving through circumstances, but as someone who is influencing them through the way you carry yourself. And this is where the narrative expands beyond your personal experience, because what you have developed internally is now beginning to interact with external structures, with environments, with systems that respond to consistency. And that interaction creates new dynamics, new possibilities, but also new levels of evaluation, because when something stands out, it is often examined more closely, not always with clear intention, but with a natural curiosity that seeks to understand what makes it different. And what they are trying to understand, whether consciously or not, is what you represent, because you no longer fit the expected trajectory. You no longer follow the patterns that would have made your outcome predictable. And that unpredictability is not chaotic. It is structured. It is the result of a deeper alignment that does not rely on external conditions. And that is what makes it difficult to categorize, because most systems rely on patterns that can be anticipated, behaviors that can be measured, responses that can be predicted. But when someone operates from a place that is not easily influenced by those variables, it creates a gap in understanding a space where existing frameworks do not fully apply. And this is where you may begin to feel a shift, not just internally, but in how your path begins to open in ways that are different from before. Not necessarily easier, but more aligned, more reflective of who you have become rather than who you were. And while this stage may not come with full clarity, it carries a sense of direction that is rooted in what you have already proven, not to others, but through your own experience, because you have already demonstrated that you can move without certainty, that you can continue without external validation, that you can remain steady when conditions are unstable, and those qualities are not easily overlooked. They form a pattern that, once recognized, cannot be ignored. And so what you are stepping into is a phase where your consistency is being observed, your trajectory is being acknowledged, and your presence is beginning to interact with larger dynamics. And while you may not see the full picture yet, you can trust that what has been developed within you is now creating movement beyond you, opening paths that align with the version of yourself you have become. And as you continue to move forward with that same steadiness, that same internal alignment, you will begin to see that the very things that once felt like isolation were actually preparation, positioning you in a way that allows you to step into what comes next with a level of clarity and strength that could not have been built any other way. And as this observation around you becomes more focused, more intentional, more aware of the pattern you carry, it leads to a moment that is not always spoken out loud, but is deeply felt within the dynamics around you. Because at a certain point, those who are watching, those who are trying to understand, begin attempting to define you, to place you into a category that makes sense within their existing frameworks. And this is where the real distinction becomes clear, because you do not fit, not in the way they expect, not in the way they are used to, not in a way that allows you to simplify it into something predictable. And that is not a flaw, that is the very evidence of what you have become. And the reason they cannot define you is because your development did not follow a linear path. It did not come from a single source. It was not shaped by one environment, one influence, or one set of conditions. It was formed through contrast, through pressure, through moments that forced you to adapt, to grow, to expand beyond what was expected. And when something is built through that kind of process, It carries layers. It carries depth. It carries a level of complexity that cannot be reduced to a simple label. And so when they try to understand you, they find that every definition they attempt to apply only captures a part of you, never the whole. And that creates a kind of uncertainty because people are more comfortable with what they can define, what they can predict, what they can place into a known category. And this is where the question begins to form, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, a question about what you represent, about how you fit into the larger structure, about whether you align with what already exists, or whether you challenge it in some way. And this is often where people begin to assess in terms of value or impact, trying to determine if you are something that can be integrated, something that can be utilized, or something that disrupts the existing order. And while that assessment may not always be visible, it is part of how systems and environments respond to what they cannot immediately categorize. And what makes this moment so significant is that you are no longer operating from a place where you need to adjust yourself to fit those categories. You are not reshaping your identity to make others more comfortable. You are not reducing your complexity to be more easily understood. Instead, you are continuing to move in alignment with what you have discovered within yourself, and that alignment is what prevents you from being confined to a single definition. Because you are not static, you are evolving. You are responsive, you are aware. And that combination makes you difficult to contain within fixed expectations. And this is where your power becomes more evident, not as something you need to assert or prove, but as something that naturally exists because you are no longer limited by the need to be understood. In conventional terms, you are no longer dependent on fitting into roles that were designed without your full depth in mind, and that independence creates a different kind of presence, one that is not easily influenced, not easily redirected, not easily reduced. And while that may create uncertainty for those who are trying to define you, it creates clarity for you because you no longer need external definitions to understand who you are. And this clarity allows you to move with a different kind of confidence, one that is rooted in self-awareness rather than external validation, one that does not require constant confirmation, one that remains steady even when others are still trying to figure you out. And that steadiness is what carries you forward. Because when you are not anchored to external definitions, you are free to continue evolving without limitation. Free to step into new levels of understanding, new levels of alignment, new levels of expression that are not constrained by what others expect you to be. And so what you are stepping into now is not just a phase of being seen. It is a phase of being recognized as something that cannot be easily categorized, something that exists beyond simple definitions, something that continues to unfold as you move forward. And that is where your true strength lies, not in being fully understood by everyone around you, but in being fully aligned with yourself. Because when you reach that point, the need to be defined by others fades, and what remains is a clarity that allows you to move forward without hesitation, without confusion, and without the need to fit into anything that does not reflect the full scope of who you have become. And as everything begins to settle into place as you step back and look at the full picture of what you've been through, what you've carried, what you've become, you start to understand something that once felt impossible to grasp. Because the truth is, you were never meant to be easily understood. You were never meant to fit neatly into expectations that were too small for your growth. And what once felt like confusion, like isolation, like being overlooked or misunderstood, now reveals itself as part of a much deeper process. A process that was not designed to make you comfortable, but to make you real, to strip away everything that could not hold your true identity so that what remained would be undeniable. And when you see it from this perspective, the breaking no longer looks like destruction. It looks like exposure. It looks like the removal of everything that was not aligned with who you were, always meant to become. And that realization carries a different kind of weight, because it shifts you out of the question of why did this happen to me, and into the understanding of what was being formed through this. And once you make that shift, everything begins to take on a new meaning. The silence, the distance, the pressure, the moments where you felt unseen. They were not signs that you were forgotten. They were conditions that allowed something deeper to develop without interference. And now standing where you are with everything you've learned, everything you've realized, everything you've integrated, you are no longer the same person who entered that season. You are someone who has seen themselves at a deeper level, someone who has identified a core that does not collapse under pressure, someone who does not need to be defined by others in order to move forward with clarity. And that is where your true power begins, not in being recognized by everyone, but in recognizing yourself fully. And if this message resonated with you, if you felt something in it that connected to your own experience, take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment. They couldn't define me below, because that statement is not just a reflection of what you've been through. It's a declaration of who you are becoming. And this is only the beginning, because your story is not ending here. It is unfolding in ways that will continue to reveal just how far you've come and how much further you are capable of going.